Hey everyone, David Barnett here. It's been a long time since I told you a story. So today I'm going to tell you a story that hits rather close to home. It's a story about things that have gone on in my own house, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to illustrate things that are important to understand about sellers' discretionary earnings, understanding depreciation, or capital expenditures when buying a small business. So stay tuned. It's going to be a great episode.
I'm David C. Barnett, and you're tuned in to Small Business and Deal Making, the podcast, YouTube channel, and blog where I talk about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium sized businesses while controlling risk. So, if you're looking to take control of your future through buying a business one day, or if you already own a business and you're looking to grow or exit, you've come to the right place. I talk about interesting things, I talk to interesting people, and I answer your questions every week right here. So, be sure to hit like and be sure to hit subscribe, and let's get to it. Are you thinking of growing your business or beginning a journey into entrepreneurship? Take a shortcut to success by buying an existing and profitable business the right way. Visit businessbuyeradvantage.com and learn more about my online training, group coaching, and consulting services designed to help you win.
All right. So today we're going to imagine something a little bit different than what I've ever talked about before. Because I constantly get the same sort of questions around the same kinds of topics. And especially for people that are new into the space, they might have a hard time getting their head around some of these ideas and concepts. And so over the last few months, particularly this last month, but then again last summer, a few things have happened here at my house. And I just realized the other day, hey, this is an ideal example that I can use to illustrate some of the concepts that we talk about on this channel in a way that people can really understand. Because for many of you, you'll be able to appreciate, being in my shoes, dealing with the kinds of things I've been dealing with that I'm going to tell you in the story. So, first of all, a little bit of background, which is important. Okay. So, back in 2015, I bought this house in a crown liquidation process. So, I live in Canada, and my house used to belong to the army, and the whole neighborhood actually did. And so a few years before 2015, they closed the military base here in Moncton and went through a process of declaring the houses surplus. And that there's a whole thing that they have to do. They have to do environmental surveys and make sure that other governments maybe don't want them and things like this. But eventually it got to the point where they could offer them for sale to the public. And there was an open tender process, and I made a bid. And I've got videos about this way back on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out, but I became the owner of this house. Now, what's important about this is that all the houses on my street, um, basically, the whole neighborhood really follow four different building plans, right? So there's four different styles of houses. They just kept using the same plan over and over. So on my street, I've got about eight or nine neighbors who I've met. Some, briefly, others I've gotten to know quite well, but they live in exactly the same house as I do, the same layout. And when natural gas came into our neighborhood in the early 2000s, the Army decided to put natural gas hot water heaters and furnaces in all the houses all at once. So we've all got the same model of furnace that was all installed like in the same week in 2007. So why is this important? Well, because it gives me certain reference points that the average person may not have when they are just living in their house, right? And they've got their hot water heater, they got their furnace. It doesn't really relate at all to their neighbors, but mine actually does. So, what I started to notice about a year and a half ago was the increased frequency of plumbers on my street. And I actually noticed some hot water heaters being taken out of some of my neighbors' houses. And so, with a few inquiries, I discovered that some of my neighbors were starting to have problems with their hot water tanks leaking or, valves breaking, this kind of thing. And so I went downstairs to my own hot water heater, which is a natural gas hot water heater. And lo and behold, it was installed in 2007. And so last summer would have been the summer of 2025. And so this machine is quite old. I called a plumber that I normally use, and I just asked, like, what kind of age should I be expecting out of this machine, before it gives me trouble? And I was basically told, 12, 14 years is kind of their lifespan. And I was way beyond that. And so I decided to be preemptive. Okay. And here's where we're gonna start to talk about some of the concepts I want to explain. So let's imagine that my house and my household were a business. Okay. So my income that I take from my business. So twice a month, I take a draw a salary from ALP, my company, into my own personal bank account. Let's imagine that that is the income of my household, as though my household were a business. Okay. And if all of the expenses, the regular expenses of running the household, were like the expenses of a business, we'd have groceries, we'd have the power bill, we'd have the gas bill, et cetera. And then the leftover money would be the profit or the seller's discretionary earnings. Okay. So we're going to relate my hot water heater and then my furnace to this whole understanding of how SDE works when we're looking at a small business. So when I spoke with the plumber, one of the things he said to me is he said, if you call the gas company, they have a leasing program where you don't have to fork out all the money for a hot water heater and installation. You can get the gas company to do it, and they will in turn put a lease charge on your gas bill for like a decade, or 8 years or 10 years or something like that. So I called the gas company because I wasn't in a rush. So there was no leak at the moment. So had time to shop around. So I called the gas company, and in fact, this program was available to me. And so I decided to sign up for it. So what happened was some plumbers came, they brought in the brand new gas hot water heater, they installed it all. I didn't have to pay out any money at all. And now my gas bill is $25 a month more than it was before. And I'm going to pay that extra charge, for 8 or 10 years. I forget exactly how much it is. So if you were looking at buying my house or if we're going to imagine it's a business, right? What would you be doing when you see that gas expense, right? In all likelihood, you would treat the hot water heater as though it was like a piece of rental equipment. So we see this quite often in small businesses where they don't really have any kind of leased or rented equipment, but they might have a leased photocopier in the office, right? With a small monthly charge. And what most business buyers will typically do is they'll just kind of look at it as an expense. They'll just leave it in as part of the expenses in the calculation of the free cash flow. And why? Well, that monthly payment obviously is money that's going out of my pocket. And what is that money? It's actually a mixture of two things. It's a mixture of depreciation and interest because basically I'm paying for the hot water heater as I use up its useful life. At the end of the payments, it won't be worth much because it'll be a 10-year-old hot water heater and I'll be looking to replace it again, right? So in the normal way that we calculate seller's discretionary earnings or EBITDA, a charge that is a mixture of interest and depreciation should normally be added back. But most people wouldn't do it because it's such a small incidental charge, right? And in doing so, in ignoring it and leaving it as part of the expenses, what that business buyer is actually doing is they are recognizing the effect of that equipment ownership or stewardship on their true cash flow. Because whether you own the hot water heater outright or you buy the hot water heater or you lease the hot water heater, et cetera, at some point in your lifespan as the homeowner, you're going to have to pay for it in one way or another. Okay. If a business broker was preparing the sale of my house, they would have found that and they would have added it back and said, this is depreciation and interest. It's not part of the true cash flow to increase the seller's discretionary earnings. Okay. So that was the hot water heater. Now, a few months ago, actually a few weeks ago, I would say, here at the house, my son woke up in the morning and told me, "Hey, Dad, the house is really cold." And I went and looked, and it was only 14 degrees in the house. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it was chilly. Okay, so I go downstairs. The furnace isn't working, so I unplug it. I plugged it back in, and it started to do its reboot cycle, and it kind of quit. Right. So I called the HVAC guy. I need some help with my furnace. Something's going on. So he comes over, checks a few things, makes a few adjustments. It seems to work. And then 3 days later, kaput. It doesn't work anymore. Right. So a different technician comes over with a bigger set of tools and kind of does a more in-depth inspection. And the secondary heat exchanger thingamajigger is not working right. And he explains to me that this can occur over time, with impurities, sediments, condensation, that kind of thing. Here's the kicker though. The furnace was from 2007, right? Which means that there was 19 years for this thing to fail. And surprisingly enough, the doohickey that is broken is actually covered under warranty. Okay. So the HVAC guy basically gives me a choice. He says, I can get the part for free from the distributor because you're covered under warranty. It'll cost about $900 in labor to disassemble your furnace and put the new one in. Or you can just buy a new furnace, right? And then he goes on to explain that there's the furnace blower, there's the impeller fan, there's the control board, and then there was something else, maybe the burner. But basically, he said, there's four other major components here that could go anytime because of the age of this machine, and each one of those could be another like 1,200 to $2,000 repair. So he's kind of setting me up, saying like, this thing is at the end of its life. You could be looking at potentially a money pit situation. Maybe it's time just to go with something new, which I ultimately opted to do. Now, like in any business, if you need to replace a major piece of equipment, you've got some choices about how you're going to do it. You could take cash out of your bank account and buy the new furnace. That's one way to do it, right? Now, this would be a capital expenditure. And if my household was a business, what would happen is that the money would leave my bank account and then the fixed assets of the company would go up by an equal amount because I had simply exchanged cash for another kind of asset, which would be a furnace. And that's not an expense, right? In accounting terms, right? What would have happened though is it would have had a real cost to it. I would have spent the furnace actually cost me about $8,700. So what then happens? Well, at the end of the year, what would happen is the accountants would then calculate what the depreciation on that asset would be, and the depreciation amount would end up over on the income statement or the P&L. Now, different kinds of assets have different depreciation methods. There's declining balance, which is a certain amount every year. It gets bigger, smaller as you go through time. Or there's straight line for other kinds of assets. So because my furnace has a 10-year warranty on it, we're just going to say, for the purpose of this illustration, that we're going to assume a 10-year straight line depreciation, which is likely not correct from an accounting point of view, but it's going to be for this illustration. Okay. So if I take $8,700 and I divide it by 120 months, so we're basically depreciating it over the life of its warranty from the manufacturer, what that would give me is $72.50 of depreciation every month. And so my first full year of ownership of the furnace, we would have 7250 times 12 as the depreciation expense on my income statement for my household as a business, right? And then if it was offered for sale with a business broker, that would immediately be added back as a non-cash expense, even though I forked out $8,700, right? But depreciation is not considered a cash expense for calculating EBITDA or seller's discretionary earnings, right? So the whole point of this story is I'm trying to convey how the SDE or EBITDA, when you're looking at a business, is not accurately telling you how much money you're going to make when you own a business. Okay. So, some other interesting points. We've already talked about leasing because basically, when you're faced with any kind of expenditure for new fixed assets in a business, you've got some choices. You can finance it through a capital lease, which was the example I gave you with the water heater, right? Now, when I'm looking at a larger business and I'm doing an analysis, if I see a lease payment of tens of thousands of dollars a year for a large piece of equipment, then we go through that add back process to get the EBITDA or the SDE. But then afterwards, we have to do a capex budget. Now, the reason that I don't use the depreciation figure when I'm looking at a business that I'm analyzing for a client is because the depreciation figure can be deceptively off. I gave the example with the furnace of using a straight line depreciation, which kind of shows how much the furnace wears out every year. But if I was living in the United States, I could do a bonus depreciation and I could put a depreciation of $8,700 next year. And then the year after that, I would have no depreciation, right? So you can't trust the depreciation figure in a small business because the government creates tax incentives that allow you to manipulate depreciation to create incentive. Basically, what they're trying to do is they're trying to create incentives for companies to invest in capital assets with the idea being that they will grow, become more efficient, bigger businesses that ultimately end up paying more tax in the future when they're bigger and more profitable. But to the point, the depreciation number is not accurate for a business buyer to consider. What you have to do instead is you have to consider what would be an adequate capex budget to consider the replacement of this equipment. So we can lease the equipment. That's one way to do it. And it's very easy for us to adjust our cash flow if we have a lease in place, because all we have to do is figure out what the lease payment should be, deduct it off SDE, and now we have our capex adjusted discretionary cash flow. We could uh, use the depreciation figure if we trusted it or if it made sense, but like I just explained, it usually doesn't. The third way to take care of equipment is to save up for it, which would be to create what they call a capital reserve. So I'm going to save money every year or every month in anticipation of having to replace something important down the road. So my guesstimate of what it will cost me to buy a new furnace in 10 years' time, if the furnace today was $8,700, I'm going to guess a new furnace in 10 years' time will be 50% more, which will be $13,050. So, given a 3% yield in a savings account, I need to save $96 a month every month for the next 10 years in order to have $13,000 available to pay for the new furnace in the future, right? So we got three different things. We can lease it with a monthly payment in which our interest and depreciation are kind of wrapped up in that one payment to the leasing company. We can borrow the money or use our own cash, and then we're looking at kind of depreciation, or we can do this whole capital reserve kind of model. So that's the model that I prefer when we're looking at equipment in a business, because if we can say, if we have some kind of estimate of what the equipment in the business is worth, let's say they've got a bunch of trucks and backhoes and things like that, and it's like 150 or $200,000 worth of equipment. What I like to say is, hey, if we know on average the equipment is going to be with us for about 6 years' time, and we know on average it's going to cost us 30% more than what the equipment's worth today to replace it, or 50% more, or whatever, then we can do that math and come up with a budget, an annual amount that needs to be available to us, either to save or to make lease payments from, or whatever, right? And so this is part of analyzing what a business is worth to you, because ultimately when you buy a business, you're looking at that cash flow figure, SDE or EBITDA, and you're saying, what should I pay to obtain that cash flow, with the assumption that I'm going to be able to run the business, that the systems and everything are in place. What should I pay to buy that? And if you ignore all the stuff I'm talking about here today, what ends up happening is you buy a business, and then later when you have to do capital equipment replacement, it just comes straight out of your pocket, and it could be substantial. So for example, if I had sold the house a year ago before I replaced the hot water heater or the furnace, what would the scenario have been for the new buyer? They would have bought the house, they would have been at a point of maximum leverage, and then all of a sudden, they would have had to replace a furnace at least. They probably wouldn't have replaced the hot water heater preemptively like I did, but let's say they did. They would have been out, almost $10,000 out of pocket, unforeseen extra money on top of the purchase of the business, my house, right? And that kind of thing can kill someone when they're new in a brand new business, when suddenly they have to replace equipment and they've got to come out of pocket with all this cash. If the new owner a year ago had hired a home inspector who noticed that the hot water heater and the furnace were so old, then they would have come back. And what do you think they would have asked for? Well, they would have said, hey, listen, Your furnace and your hot water heater are kind of old. It's like $10,000 to replace those new, and they're going to have to be replaced at some point in the next couple of years. So we maybe want a discount on the house, right? That would have been a reasonable way to try to reconcile this problem. Maybe they would have said, given the replacement costs and the age, we think that you should discount the house by like $8,000, um, which would have been what a clever and intelligent negotiator would have done, right? Um, so that then reiterates for the business owners out there who want to try to say that if they buy brand new equipment that their business is somehow worth more. I just want to highlight how that's just not the case. You see, again, thinking of my house as a business, in Canada, houses are expected to have reliable heat sources in the wintertime, especially, right? It's just what is the market price of your house? Let's say it's $200,000 or whatever it is. Like that market price just assumes that there's a working furnace. And if you don't have a good quality working furnace, what ends up happening is the buyer wants to discount. If you do have a good working furnace, then you've just checked the box, right? So for business owners out there who are thinking that they can get away with avoiding replacing equipment, like deferring maintenance and capex to take more money out of their business, hoping that when they sell the business, that the buyer will take care of buying all new stuff. This is the warning, is that a prudent buyer, especially one that's working with me, is going to examine all of that stuff. They're going to have a mechanic come and take a look, and they're going to realize, hey, this business is going to have to fork out a bunch of money in the near future. They're going to want to discount the price of the business to make up for the fact that they've got this huge bill that is imminently approaching. Anyway, so once the decision was made to replace the furnace, the fellas were able to come relatively quickly and get the new thing in there. Don't worry, we didn't freeze. I've got a backup. We have some electric plug-in heaters that we were able to use to get us across the chilly gap, um, and everything is great. And now the house is going to be clear sailing for the next decade, I hope. Anyway, I hope that story and that illustration helps to clarify things when it comes to understanding that seller's discretionary earnings and EBITDA do not include these costs for equipment and fixed assets, and how you need to be thinking about them when you're buying a business or when you are preparing to sell a business. You need to make sure that your equipment is in tip top shape, or else you will likely end up paying for it one way or another. Either you're going to replace stuff before your sale, or you're going to end up having someone negotiate the price downward to make up for the fact that they're going to have to shell out a bunch of money. The What you are selling when you sell a business is you're selling the cash flow. You're selling that the money every month that the buyer is going to be able to put in their pocket. And if they can foresee that the cash flow will not continue because there's going to be a problem with some of the assets in the business, then it's going to affect what someone's willing to pay. It's as simple as that. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. If you are serious about buying a business and you don't want to make a mistake, then you should be heading over to businessbuyeradvantage.com, where you can learn all about my online training, my group coaching, and the analysis consulting projects that I do to help people just like you who are looking at buying a business. And if you're a business owner that's looking to get out, go to howtosellmyownbusiness.com. It's where I talk about all the services that we do with small business owners who want to sell one day. And with that, I will say thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.
So, how can you learn more about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium sized businesses? Easy. Go over to my blog site, davidcbarnett.com, where you can learn more about me and how I work with my clients. You can learn more about my books and courses that I've prepared for you. You can find out how to subscribe to my email list, the YouTube playlists, and more. There's literally hundreds of hours of content there, all for free, and I'd love for you to be my guest. Special thanks go to Mark Willis at Lake Growth Financial, today's video sponsor. Mark helps people better manage their personal and business finances through the Bank on Yourself insurance strategy. This is something I've done personally and I've seen others use it successfully for years. Go to newbankingsolution.com to find all the interviews I've done with Mark and learn more about the advantages of these programs. While there, sign up for a free consultation to learn what this solution might look like for you.